On a stormy night, Darren, a successful black pilot, stops to help a stranded driver, only to find himself targeted by Officer Reed, a prejudiced cop who assumes the worst. What begins as a tense confrontation spirals into a life-or-death situation when the stranded man collapses, and Darren must act fast to save him. The encounter leaves Reed questioning everything he thought he knew, and sets both men on a journey that will test their beliefs, challenge their biases, and reveal that karma has its own way of setting things right. Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now let's dive in. The sky was a swirling mass of charcoal clouds, rumbling with distant thunder as Darren navigated the lonely back road. Sheets of rain lashed against his windshield, and the rhythmic sweep of the wipers barely kept up with the deluge. He adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, trying to focus through the relentless storm. Darren preferred taking the highway, but the weather had forced him to reroute. The GPS was glitchy, and now he was on this unfamiliar stretch, hoping to make it home without further complications. The hum of his luxury sedan felt oddly reassuring. It was a well-earned purchase, a reflection of years of dedication and hard work. Darren had fought his way through an industry that wasn't exactly welcoming to people like him. Becoming a pilot had been a monumental achievement, and tonight he was returning from a meeting where he had spoken passionately about the need for diversity in aviation. But even that sense of accomplishment was dampened by fatigue and frustration. He knew the roadblocks he faced weren't just behind him. They followed him, shadow-like, wherever he went. As Darren rounded a bend, his headlights caught a shape on the side of the road. A car sat awkwardly on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking weakly through the rain. A figure stood beside it, waving for help. Despite the storm and the lateness of the hour, Darren didn't think twice. He slowed to a crawl, pulling over just ahead of the stranded car. He grabbed his umbrella from the passenger seat and stepped out into the storm, rain immediately soaking through his jacket. "You need some help?" he called out over the noise of the downpour. The stranded driver, an older man with a haggard expression, looked relieved. "Thank you. I think my battery died. I was on my way to visit my daughter. I've been standing here for ages." Darren nodded, already glancing at the engine hood. "I've got some jumper cables in the trunk. Let's see if we can get you going." He returned to his car, feeling the wet cold seep into his clothes, and opened the trunk. As he rummaged for the cables, a pair of headlights suddenly illuminated the scene behind him. A police cruiser rolled to a stop, its lights flashing through the storm like an accusation. Darren sighed quietly. "Of course." The officer stepped out, his uniform crisp despite the rain, and adjusted his belt. "Evening," he said, walking toward Darren with a suspicious glance at the sleek car. "What's going on here?" "Just helping him jump his battery," Darren answered evenly, gesturing toward the older man's car. The officer, his name tag read Reed, gave a slow, measured nod, but there was no hint of friendliness in his expression. His eyes flicked between Darren, the car, and the older man as if assembling pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. "This your vehicle?" Reed asked, nodding toward Darren's car. Darren's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone calm. "Yes, officer, it's mine. Do you have any ID? Proof of ownership?" Darren knew what this was. He'd lived it too many times before. He fought the urge to argue and instead reached into his jacket for his wallet. "Here's my license," he said, handing it over. "And the registration is in the glove box. I can grab it if you want." Reed took the license without so much as a nod of thanks, studying it as if it might reveal some hidden secret. "Mind if I take a quick look inside the vehicle?" Darren clenched his teeth. "Is there a reason you need to search my car?" Reed's expression hardened, the faintest trace of a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "Just routine. You know how it is." Darren knew exactly how it was. This wasn't routine. It was profiling. And no matter how many times it happened, it stung just the same. The older man opened his mouth to speak, sensing the tension, but Reed shot him a glance that silenced him. Darren took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "Fine, go ahead." Reed took his time, making a show of circling the car before peering inside through the windows. The rain drummed relentlessly on the roof of the sedan, matching the frustration bubbling inside Darren. Reed reached for the door handle and opened it without a word, leaning inside to search. As Reed rifled through the contents of the glove compartment, Darren's hands curled into fists at his sides. He felt exposed, humiliated. The officer was rummaging through his personal belongings as if he were a criminal, and there was nothing Darren could do to stop it. After a few minutes, Reed emerged, holding Darren's briefcase. "What's in here?" "Documents," Darren answered stiffly. "From work." The officer raised a skeptical brow. "Mind opening it?" Darren's patience was wearing thin, but he nodded, not wanting to escalate the situation. He unlatched the briefcase and showed Reed the contents. Papers, flight schedules, a laptop. Nothing more. Reed grunted, seeming almost disappointed. He handed the briefcase back and took a step back toward the cruiser, as if to say, "Go. For now, you're free to go." The older man, still standing awkwardly by his car, tried to intervene. "Officer, this gentleman was just helping me. There's no need for all this." Reed gave him a curt nod, dismissing the comment without so much as a glance at Darren. "Just doing my job," Reed muttered under his breath, but it lacked conviction. Darren stood there, soaked and fuming, his heart pounding in his chest. "Your job," he repeated, his voice low but steady. "Your job is to harass people who look like me, right?" Reed's gaze snapped back to Darren, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. Just the storm and the weight of unspoken truths. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Darren could see the flicker of discomfort in Reed's eyes. Before Reed could respond, the older man suddenly clutched his chest and stumbled. His face twisted in pain, and he gasped for breath, collapsing onto the wet pavement. Darren reacted instantly, instincts taking over. "Hey, stay with me," he shouted, dropping to his knees beside the man. He tilted the man's head back, checking his pulse. "We need an ambulance," he yelled over his shoulder at Reed. Reed stood frozen for a moment, as if unsure of what to do. The sight of Darren, a man he had just profiled and treated with suspicion, now trying to save a life, seemed to throw him off balance. "Call 911. Darren barked, snapping Reed out of his daze. Reed fumbled for his radio and relayed the emergency. Darren, meanwhile, began performing CPR, his hands moving with precision and focus. The rain continued to pour, but Darren didn't stop. He pressed down on the man's chest, counting under his breath, willing him to breathe again. The storm raged on around them, but in that moment, everything else faded away. The profiling, the humiliation, the anger. There was only the man's life in Darren's hands, and the hope that it wasn't too late. The ambulance's distant sirens finally cut through the noise of the storm, growing louder as it approached. Darren didn't stop until the paramedics arrived, taking over with practiced efficiency. They loaded the older man onto a stretcher and rushed him into the ambulance, thanking Darren for his help before speeding away into the night. Darren stood up slowly, drenched and exhausted. He glanced at Reed, who looked as though he was struggling to find words. But Darren didn't care. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his car, the weight of the night pressing down on him. As he opened the door, Reed finally spoke. Darren paused, looking over his shoulder with a tired, bitter expression. "You never even asked for my name," he said quietly. Then, without waiting for a response, Darren got into his car and drove away, leaving Reed standing alone in the rain, the storm echoing the turmoil within him. The storm outside had only just begun to recede, but inside Darren's mind, it still raged. As he drove down the darkened road, the rhythmic hum of the car did little to soothe him. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel, the weight of the encounter with Officer Reed sitting heavily on his chest like a stone he couldn't shake off. He had dealt with this before, too many times, but every encounter chipped away at him, leaving scars not visible to the eye. It wasn't the inconvenience that got to Darren. It was the sheer exhaustion of it all. The constant pressure to stay calm, to be polite, to swallow his frustration and keep himself composed for the sake of survival. Tonight, like so many other nights, he had to remind himself that even the smallest misstep could turn a routine interaction into a dangerous one. As a black man, he had mastered the art of self-control, but that didn't mean it got any easier. His mind drifted back to earlier years, when his love for aviation first blossomed. As a child, he would sit by the airport fence, mesmerized by the massive planes that cut through the sky, dreaming that one day he'd be the one guiding them. But the path to becoming a pilot had been anything but smooth. Darren had faced closed doors, subtle slights, and outright discrimination along the way. He remembered being the only black student in his flight training class. Even after passing every test and logging more hours than most of his peers, he was met with skepticism and doubt. "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" Passengers would occasionally ask, their eyes widening when they realized their pilot didn't look the way they expected. It was always there, a simmering undercurrent of doubt that seemed to follow him wherever he went, no matter how accomplished he became. But Darren fought back in his own way. He became an advocate for change within the aviation industry, speaking at conferences and mentoring young aspiring pilots from underrepresented backgrounds. He knew his success wasn't just for himself, it was for every kid who had been told they didn't belong in the captain's seat. Still, the burden of representation weighed heavily. Every time he was stopped, every time he was questioned, it was another reminder that he couldn't simply exist. He had to constantly prove that he deserved to be where he was. He sighed, his hands flexing on the wheel as the memories gave way to the present. Tonight, the profiling wasn't just a microaggression. It had been humiliating, invasive, and downright dehumanizing. It wasn't just about one cop with a chip on his shoulder. It was about a system designed to see him as suspicious, no matter how many flight hours he logged, no matter how many lives he touched. At the same time, miles away, Officer Reed sat in his patrol car, parked just off the highway. The rain tapped gently against the windows, but his mind was far from calm. He rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling within him. Frustration, guilt, and a faint trace of something he couldn't quite name. Reed didn't like to think of himself as a bad person. He had grown up in a small working-class family, raised by a father who saw the world in stark contrasts, right versus wrong, us versus them. His father had been a cop too, a gruff man who believed that trouble always came dressed in certain skin tones. "You gotta stay sharp out there," his father had told him more times than he could count. "Never let your guard down." Those words had become gospel to Reed, shaping how he approached the job from the moment he put on the uniform. But as Reed sat in the quiet of his cruiser, replaying the night's events in his mind, doubt began to creep in. The way Darren had looked at him, tired, frustrated, disappointed, gnawed at him. Darren hadn't been dangerous. In fact, he had saved a man's life right in front of Reed, despite being treated like a suspect just moments earlier. And that simple truth gnawed at him. Reed had followed the rules, or so he thought. But rules didn't explain why he felt so unsettled. If anything, the rules had given him an excuse to act on instincts he now realized were rooted in something darker, something inherited, not chosen. He thought back to his upbringing, to the family dinners where his father would recount tales of the job, punctuating each story with warnings about those people. As a kid, Reed hadn't questioned it. He had wanted to be just like his father to earn his respect. But now, sitting in his car, soaked from the rain and weighed down by guilt, Reed realized how those stories had shaped him, teaching him to see certain people as threats before they even opened their mouths. And for what? What had his suspicion earned him tonight? A confrontation with a man who had done nothing wrong, who had stepped in to save someone Reed would have let slip away. Reed felt a sharp pang of shame. He hated how easily he had fallen into the patterns his father had laid out for him, as if his mind had been pre-programmed to expect the worst from men like Darren. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, his thoughts drifting back to the man on the side of the road, the one Darren had helped. If Darren hadn't been there, that man might not have made it through the night. Reed knew that deep down, and yet, instead of gratitude, his first instinct had been suspicion. The rain continued to fall, softer now, as if the storm outside was mirroring the one inside Reed's head. He knew he had messed up, but the realization was only the beginning. Change was more than just acknowledging a mistake. It was about understanding the harm and finding a way forward. Darren had asked him a simple question during the encounter. "Why did you assume the worst about me?" And Reed had no answer. Or at least, not one he wanted to admit out loud. Meanwhile, Darren's car rolled smoothly through the wet streets, the GPS now cooperating as it guided him closer to home. He glanced at the dashboard clock, feeling the weight of the day catch up with him. His meeting earlier had been a success, but it was hard to celebrate when encounters like tonight's made everything feel so fragile, like no matter how far he went, he could always be dragged back by someone else's prejudice. He thought about the man he had saved. Darren hadn't hesitated for a second. The moment the man collapsed, he acted, not because he wanted to prove anything, but because it was the right thing to do. That was who he was. And yet, moments later, he had been forced to defend his very existence to someone who saw him as nothing more than a potential threat. As the car glided along the rain-slicked streets, Darren allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He knew he wouldn't let tonight define him. He had come too far to let one bad encounter erase everything he had built. But the scars were real, and they were deep. He wondered how many more times he would have to bite his tongue. How many more times he would have to remind himself that staying calm was a matter of survival. The storm outside had begun to clear, but the one inside Darren remained. And as Officer Reed sat in his cruiser grappling with his own storm of emotions, both men found themselves at a crossroads, one facing the burden of proving his worth, the other facing the uncomfortable truth about the man he had become. Neither of them knew it yet, but the events of that stormy night had set something in motion. A shift, an opportunity for change. But whether they would seize it or let it pass remained to be seen. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, but the night felt heavier than ever. Darren pulled his car into the driveway of his small, modern townhouse and sat behind the wheel for a moment, letting the engine idle. His thoughts swirled with frustration, but more than anything, exhaustion wrapped around him like a lead blanket. He leaned his head back against the seat, staring at the ceiling, wondering how many more times he would have to fight battles he didn't ask for. His mind kept replaying the encounter with Reed. Every question, every glance, every moment that reminded him how precarious his existence was in the eyes of someone with power. Even now, the memory of Reed's search of his car felt like an open wound. It wasn't just invasive, it was degrading. It was the look in the officer's eyes, the subtle but unmistakable assumption that Darren didn't belong behind the wheel of that luxury car, that he couldn't be successful without being suspicious. Darren took a deep breath and shut off the engine. There was no point in dwelling on it now. He gathered his things and headed inside, leaving the storm behind him, at least for the night. Miles away, Officer Reed drove aimlessly through the quiet streets, trying to clear his head. The night was still, save for the occasional rumble of thunder in the distance. But inside his mind, the storm raged on. The moment the adrenaline wore off, guilt had taken its place, gnawing at him with an uncomfortable persistence. Darren's parting words, "You never even asked for my name," echoed in his mind, over and over again. Reed knew he had crossed a line. He could try to justify it to himself, say he was just doing his job, following protocol. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the full truth. His instincts hadn't been about safety, they had been about bias. And in the process, he had humiliated a man who had done nothing wrong. Worse, that man had gone out of his way to help someone in need, doing what Reed himself should have done. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, feeling the weight of his actions settle on him like the damp air outside. What bothered him most wasn't just that he had been wrong about Darren, it was that being wrong didn't even surprise him. He realized with a jolt that he had spent so long seeing people like Darren as potential threats that he didn't know how to see them any other way. The older man whom Darren had helped, Frank Dawson, lay in a hospital bed that night, slowly recovering from the heart attack that had almost taken his life. The nurses had told him that if Darren hadn't acted as quickly as he did, things might have ended very differently. As Frank drifted in and out of sleep, he thought about the events of the evening, about the young man who had stopped to help him when no one else had. And he thought about the officer, standing stiff and suspicious in the rain, as if kindness itself was something to be questioned. Frank made a mental note to reach out to Darren as soon as he was well enough. He owed him more than just a thank you. He owed him a chance to be seen for who he truly was, a man with integrity, kindness, and skill. But even more than that, Frank wanted to make sure the world knew who Darren was, starting with that officer who had treated him like a suspect instead of a savior. A few days later, the storm clouds had long since cleared, but the memory of that night lingered like an unhealed bruise. Darren went about his routine, flying from city to city, attending meetings, and mentoring young people who aspired to follow in his footsteps. But the encounter with Reed remained on his mind, a constant reminder of how quickly things could have gone wrong. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it wasn't worth dwelling on, but the truth was it bothered him deeply. Not because it was unusual, but because it wasn't. Meanwhile, Reed found himself wrestling with feelings he didn't quite know how to process. He had always prided himself on being a good officer, someone who protected and served. But that night in the storm had forced him to confront a truth he didn't want to face. He had let his bias dictate his actions. And in doing so, he had failed. Not just Darren, but himself. Reed knew he had to do something to make things right, but he wasn't sure how. Apologizing felt like a start, but it also felt insufficient. How do you apologize for years of ingrained prejudice, for every unkind glance, every baseless assumption? How do you make amends when words feel hollow? One night, as he sat in his patrol car staring out at the quiet streets, Reed made a decision. He wasn't going to let this moment define him. He had made a mistake, a serious one, but he could choose to learn from it. He could choose to change. Days later, Reed tracked down Frank Dawson's hospital room. He entered hesitantly, his hat clutched in his hands. Frank looked up from his bed, his eyes weary but kind. "Officer," he greeted, his voice rough from the hospital air. "What brings you here?" I wanted to check in," Reed said, shifting awkwardly. "See how you're doing. And, I wanted to talk about that night." Frank raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You mean the night that young man saved my life?" Reed nodded slowly. "Yeah, that night." Frank leaned back against the pillows, studying the officer with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said after a moment, "that man, Darren, he didn't have to stop. He could have kept driving, but he didn't. And when I collapsed, he didn't hesitate. He saved me, plain and simple. And you? You were standing there, watching, questioning him." Reed felt the words land heavily on his heart, but he didn't interrupt. He knew Frank was right. "You looked at him, and you saw a threat," Frank continued. "I looked at him, and I saw a decent man, a man who cared enough to help a stranger in the middle of a storm." Reed swallowed hard. "I know." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I was wrong, and I know an apology isn't enough, but I want to make things right. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to try." Frank gave him a long, measured look, then nodded. "That's a start." Reed left the hospital that night feeling lighter, but he knew the real work was just beginning. Change wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a choice, one he would have to make every day. And Darren? He continued to live his life with quiet determination, knowing that his worth wasn't defined by the way others saw him. He knew there would be other storms, other encounters that would test his patience and resolve. But he also knew that each time he chose kindness over anger, strength over bitterness, he was reshaping the world in his own way, one act at a time. The storm had broken, but its lessons remained. And as Reed drove through the quiet streets, determined to be better, karma hung in the air like a distant thunder, reminding them both that change, real, meaningful change, wasn't just about what happened that night. It was about what they did with it afterward. The days passed, but the events of that stormy night clung to Darren like wet clothes that wouldn't dry. He went through the motions of his work, flying planes from city to city, but the memory of the encounter weighed heavily on his heart. Every time he strapped into the pilot's seat and adjusted the controls, he thought about how easily things could have gone wrong that night. The sting of Officer Reed's suspicion was not unfamiliar, but this time it felt sharper, cutting deeper into places he thought were already scarred over. He kept returning to a simple truth. Even after all these years of success, after all his achievements, there were still those who only saw him as someone to be questioned, to be suspected, to be dismissed. No matter how high he flew, literally or figuratively, the world found ways to clip his wings. And it exhausted him. At night, the weariness set in deeper. He lay awake, thinking about the stranded man he had saved. His mind replayed every moment, how quickly he had reacted, the feeling of the man's pulse returning under his hands, and the relief when the ambulance finally arrived. Darren knew he had done the right thing. But it was the look on Reed's face that haunted him. A mix of confusion and shame, as if the officer had never considered the possibility that Darren could be a hero instead of a threat. Meanwhile, Officer Reed found himself drowning in his own thoughts. The image of Darren kneeling in the rain, saving a man's life without hesitation, haunted him. Reed had replayed the encounter 100 times in his mind, each time seeing his mistakes more clearly. The profiling, the search, the distrust, it was all there, laid bare under the harsh light of hindsight. The problem wasn't just what had happened that night, it was what it revealed about him. Reed had spent his entire career believing he was one of the good ones, someone who treated people fairly and with respect. But now, that belief felt like a lie. He had been blind to his own biases, and that blindness had caused harm. It was a hard pill to swallow, but there was no denying it. He had been wrong about Darren. And worse, he knew it wasn't the first time he had made that kind of mistake. Reed thought about his father, a man who had shaped so much of who he was, for better or worse. His father had always taught him to be tough, to see the world in black and white. There are good guys and bad guys, his father used to say, and your job is to figure out which is which. But that kind of thinking didn't leave much room for nuance, and it certainly didn't leave room for men like Darren, who didn't fit neatly into those categories. Sitting alone in his small apartment, Reed tried to imagine what Darren's life must be like, constantly being judged, second-guessed, and suspected, not because of anything he had done, but because of how he looked. Reed felt a pang of regret so sharp it almost hurt. He had been part of that system, whether he wanted to admit it or not. And the worst part, he had never even questioned it until now. One evening, after a long shift, Reed found himself standing outside a community center on the edge of town. He had heard about a panel discussion being held there, one focused on building trust between law enforcement and marginalized communities. Reed hesitated at the entrance, feeling out of place in his uniform. But something inside him urged him to go in. The room was small but packed, filled with people from all walks of life, activists, students, elders, and even a few off-duty officers like himself. At the front of the room, a speaker took the microphone. Reed's heart skipped a beat when he recognized him. It was Darren. Darren stood confidently at the podium, his voice steady and clear as he spoke about his experiences in aviation, the barriers he had overcome, and the importance of representation. But what struck Reed the most was how Darren talked about the need for empathy and understanding, not just in the workplace, but everywhere. There are two ways to respond to injustice, Darren said, his gaze sweeping the room. You can let it make you bitter, or you can use it to make you better. I choose the latter. But that choice isn't just for people like me. It's for everyone. If we want to build a better world, we all have to do the work. Reed felt a lump rise in his throat. Darren wasn't just talking about his own struggles. He was offering a path forward, not just for himself, but for everyone in the room, including people like Reed. When the discussion ended, Reed lingered by the exit, debating whether to approach Darren. Part of him wanted to slip out unnoticed, but he knew that wouldn't solve anything. If he wanted to be better, he had to start now. Darren was packing up his notes when Reed approached. The pilot's eyes met the officer's, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Darren's expression was guarded but not unkind, more curious than anything else. Darren, right? Reed began, shifting awkwardly on his feet. I wanted to say thank you for what you did that night, for saving that man's life. He paused, gathering his thoughts. And I also wanted to say I'm sorry for the way I treated you. It was wrong. Darren studied Reed for a moment, as if weighing the sincerity of his words. Then he gave a small nod. Thank you, he said quietly. I appreciate that. Reed hesitated, then added, I know an apology isn't enough, but I'm trying to change. I've been thinking a lot about things, about how I see people. I just wanted you to know that. Darren offered a faint smile. Not quite forgiveness, but acknowledgement. Change is hard, he said, but it's worth it. Reed nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief. If there's anything I can do, Anything at all, please let me know. Darren thought for a moment, then gave Reed a thoughtful look. Start with listening, he said. Really listening. Not just to people like me, but to the stories you don't usually hear. That's where change begins. Reed smiled, a real, genuine smile, for the first time in a long while. I'll do that, he promised. As Darren left the community center that night, a sense of quiet satisfaction settled over him. The encounter with Reed didn't erase what had happened in the storm, but it was a step forward. And sometimes that was enough. Reed watched Darren leave, feeling lighter than he had in days. The road to change was long, but for the first time, he felt ready to walk it. And as he drove home through the quiet streets, he knew that the night in the storm had been more than just a chance encounter. It had been the beginning of something new. Both men knew there would be other storms, other challenges ahead, but they also knew that change wasn't about avoiding the storm. It was about learning to navigate through it together. A few months passed, but the night of the storm lingered in the hearts of both Darren and Officer Reed, shaping their paths in ways neither of them could have anticipated. Darren continued to fly across the skies, balancing his passion for aviation with his advocacy work. He had always believed that true change required persistence, and he kept mentoring young pilots, pushing for diversity in the industry, and speaking about the systemic barriers he faced. But there was a subtle shift in him, something lighter. The conversation with Reed had not erased the pain of the encounter, but it had planted a small seed of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, people could change. Reed, on the other hand, found himself actively confronting the biases he had carried for years. The realization that he needed to change wasn't a one-time epiphany. It was an ongoing process. He attended community meetings, listened to the stories of those who had suffered under the weight of prejudice, and engaged in difficult conversations with other officers. Some were receptive, while others scoffed at his newfound openness. But Reed knew he was doing the right thing, even when it was uncomfortable. One day, as he sat in a cafe near the precinct, Reed pulled out a notebook and began drafting a letter. It was addressed to Darren, a letter that had been on his mind since the stormy night, but he hadn't quite known how to write it until now. Dear Darren, I've thought about that night in the storm more times than I can count. I wish I could go back and change how I handled things, but all I can do is say I'm sorry. Not just for that night, but for the assumptions I carried that led me to treat you the way I did. I'm learning now that apologies are just the beginning. What matters is the work I do moving forward. I've spent the past few months attending community events, listening to people who've experienced what you went through. It's been eye-opening, to say the least, and I'm committed to doing better, both on and off the job. You said something that stuck with me, that change starts with listening. I want you to know that I'm listening now. And I want to thank you, not just for what you did that night by saving Frank Dawson's life, but for giving me the opportunity to learn and grow. I don't expect forgiveness or anything in return, but I wanted you to know that you made a difference in my life, and I will carry that forward in the work I do from here on out. Sincerely, Officer James Reed. Reed folded the letter neatly and placed it in an envelope. He wasn't sure if Darren would respond, but that didn't matter. The act of writing it had been part of his own journey, a step toward becoming the man he wanted to be. Meanwhile, Darren was preparing for a special event. He had been invited to speak at an aviation awards ceremony where he would receive recognition for his contributions to the industry and his work in mentoring young pilots. It was a milestone he hadn't expected, and it felt like a validation of all the hard work he had put in over the years. But more than the award, it was the presence of his mentees in the audience that meant the most to him. They were the future, and seeing them succeed was the greatest reward he could imagine. As Darren stood backstage, adjusting his tie and preparing his speech, he noticed a familiar face in the crowd. Sitting quietly in the back row, looking slightly out of place in his civilian clothes, was Officer Reed. Their eyes met briefly, and Darren gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Reed nodded back, his expression one of quiet respect. The ceremony began, and Darren took the stage to a round of applause. As he spoke about the importance of perseverance, community, and empathy, Reed listened carefully, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. Darren's words weren't just about aviation, they were about life, about breaking down barriers and building bridges, about the power of understanding. And Reed knew, in that moment, that he was exactly where he needed to be. After the ceremony, Reed waited until most of the crowd had dispersed before approaching Darren. The pilot greeted him with a calm smile, a far cry from the tension that had defined their first encounter. "Thank you for coming," Darren said, his tone genuine. "I wouldn't have missed it," Reed replied. "I wanted to give you something." He pulled the letter from his jacket pocket and handed it to Darren. "It's just a letter, something I've been meaning to say." Darren took the envelope, turning it over in his hands. He didn't open it right away, but gave Reed a thoughtful look. "Thank you," he said simply. Reed smiled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "I meant every word," he added. Darren nodded. "I believe you." They stood there for a moment, two men who had started on opposite sides of a divide, but had found their way to something resembling understanding. It wasn't perfect. Real change never was, but it was a start. In the months that followed, both men continued their respective journeys. Darren kept flying, mentoring, and advocating for change, while Reed dedicated himself to building trust within the community and challenging the biases within his department. They didn't become best friends or stay in constant contact, but their paths crossed from time to time. At community events, conferences, and meetings. Each encounter was a reminder that change was possible, not just in the world but within individuals as well. And slowly, without either of them realizing it, the memory of that stormy night transformed from a painful experience into a lesson, a reminder that empathy could bridge even the widest gaps, that people were capable of growth, and that redemption was always within reach for those willing to seek it. In the end, the storm had passed, but its impact remained, shaping both Darren and Reed into better versions of themselves. And as they navigated the storms that life continued to throw their way, they carried with them the knowledge that every encounter held the potential for transformation. All it took was the willingness to listen, to understand, and to do better. That was the real power of karma, not as punishment, but as an opportunity for growth, for second chances, and for change. And both men, in their own way, embraced it fully. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.